Chapter 1. She kicked the chapel door open with the heel of a borrowed shoe. The hinges banged. 200 heads turned at once. Rain came in behind her in a thin gray sheet. She did not stop. She walked straight up the aisle in a black dress that was a size too big, with a yellow envelope pressed against her hip. The casket was open at the front of the room. A man in the third pew stood up halfway and sat back down. The widow gasped. The woman did not look at any of them. She walked the full length of the aisle. She stopped 2 feet from the coffin. She lifted the envelope above her head and slammed it down on the polished wood. The slap echoed off the back wall. Believe me, nobody in that room knew what was in that envelope. Stay with me on this one. Chapter 2. Her name was Myra Havorson. She was 38 years old, broke from a divorce that had taken longer than the marriage, and she had not stood on Iowa soil since she was 16. The town was Cedar Hollow. Population a little over 900. 1 stoplight. 1 grain elevator. 1 funeral home that doubled as a flower shop in the summer. She had grown up 2 miles outside the town line, on a farm that pressed up against the river and held 200 acres of bottom corn ground. Her great-grandfather had cleared that ground by hand. Her grandfather had built the barn on it. Her mother had been born in the upstairs bedroom of the farmhouse in 1953. Her mother had also died in that house 6 years after Myra left. Myra had not been at the funeral. Nobody told her about it. She read about her mother in a newspaper at a public library in St. Paul. She sat down on the carpet between the magazine racks and did not move for an hour. Then she got up and walked to the bus stop and went to her shift at the restaurant. Now here's the thing. There was a reason she had stayed away. When Myra was 16, her father, Harold Havorson, decided she would marry a young man named Carter Boone. Carter was the only son of the bank president in the next county. Harold owed that bank a lot of money. The arrangement was simple in his head. Myra would marry Carter in the spring. The debt would be reorganized. The farm would stay in the family. Myra said no on a Tuesday at the dinner table. She said no on a Wednesday in the kitchen. By Friday, she had a packed duffel bag and a bus ticket she had paid for with babysitting money. Her father stood in the doorway of the farmhouse and told her, in a voice as flat as a winter field, that if she walked out, she was no daughter of his. She walked out. She did not see him again. Not at 20. Not at 30. Not at any holiday in between. He did not call her on her wedding day. He did not call her when the marriage ended. He did not call her ever. Her older brother was named Garrett. Garrett was 3 years older than Myra. Garrett was the one who, the night before she left, had cornered her in the upstairs hallway and broken 2 of her ribs with a closed fist. He had broken them because she would not sign a paper their father had told her to sign. The paper would have made Garrett the only heir to the farm before Myra was even married off. Garrett had stayed. Garrett had married a local girl. Garrett had taken over the farm. And now Harold Havorson was dead. Heart attack in the cab of his own tractor on a Sunday afternoon. The obituary ran in the Cedar Hollow Gazette on a Wednesday. A friend of a friend mailed Myra a copy in a plain white envelope with no return address. She read it standing over a hotel sink in a town she did not live in. She sat down on the tile floor with the paper in her hand. She stayed there a long time. Her ex-husband had moved out 4 months earlier and taken the dog and most of the kitchen with him. She had been sleeping in a friend's spare room and working a dinner shift at a diner that paid in cash. Her checking account had $211 in it. Her credit card had $300 left on the limit. She was, in the strictest sense of the word, broke. She had nothing in her life that was hers except a folded yellow envelope she had kept hidden behind the back wall of every closet she had rented for 22 years. Then she stood up. She borrowed a black dress from a waitress named Pam, who worked the morning shift at her old diner. Pam had 3 kids and a bad knee and asked no questions. Pam handed Myra the dress in a plastic bag and said, Bring it back clean. She filled the tank of a used Chevy that pulled to the right and smelled like old coffee and pine air freshener. She drove south through the night on a road she had not driven in 22 years. She crossed the state line at 4 in the morning. She did not turn on the radio. She kept both hands on the wheel and watched the white lines feed into the headlights one after the other. Chapter 3. She pulled into the funeral home lot 10 minutes before the service. She did not go in right away. She sat in the Chevy with the engine off and looked at the building. White siding, black shutters, a wooden sign that read Pribble and Sons. The same sign had been there when her grandfather was buried in 1991. She had been 7 years old at that funeral. She had worn a green dress because her mother said her father hated the color black. Through the front window, she could see the back of her brother's head. Garrett had thickened. He filled out a black suit the way a man fills out a sandbag. Next to him sat his wife, blonde hair pinned tight, and 2 teenage boys Myra had never met. She did not feel anything for those boys. Not hatred, not pity. They were strangers in her father's pew. She got out of the car. The wind off the river smelled like wet hay. She crossed the lot with the envelope held flat against her side. A few people in the doorway saw her. One older woman lifted a hand to her mouth. Another whispered to the man beside her. Myra did not slow down. She had practiced this walk in 1,000 bad apartments. She kept her chin level and her steps even. Inside, the room smelled like lilies and old carpet. The casket was at the front. Open, polished oak. Her father's hands folded across his belt. He looked smaller than she remembered. He looked like a man who had finally run out of things to hold against people. She had imagined this walk for 2 decades. She had imagined it in motel rooms in Wisconsin. She had imagined it in the parking lot of a hospital where she had once spent a night in an emergency room with no insurance. She had imagined it on the day her divorce went through. She had imagined it differently every time. In every version, she had been angrier than she actually was now. In every version, she had cried. She was not crying. She felt clear instead, like a window after a long rain. Garrett saw her first. His head came up like a dog smelling smoke. He started to stand. The pastor, a soft man named Reverend Pike, raised both hands and said, "Please." Myra walked past him. She walked past her brother. She walked past her father's old farm hands, men with cracked knuckles and Sunday hats in their laps. She walked all the way to the casket. She set the yellow envelope down on the lid. Not gently. The slap of the paper on the wood made a woman in the 3rd row jump. Garrett spoke first. His voice was low. He said, "You do not belong here." Myra did not look at him. She looked at her father's closed eyes. She said, "I know what is in this envelope. I know what he did. And I am here to take back what was always mine." Behind Garrett, a man in a gray suit stood up. He was thin and tall and had a small mustache that did not suit him. His name was Daniel Voss. He had been her father's lawyer for 30 years. He had also been, for the last 2 of those years, the man who handled the will. He cleared his throat and said, "Miss Halvorson, this is not the time." Myra turned to him. She said, "Then make time, Mr. Voss, because I have a 1983 deed in this envelope that my mother gave me when I was 16. And the farm you read into Garrett's name last Tuesday was never my father's to give." The room went quiet. Then a strange thing happened. Reverend Pike sat down. Garrett's wife reached for her older boy and pulled him close like a coat. An old farmer named Walt Tilden, who had worked the Halvorson South 40 for 40 winters, leaned forward in his chair with his hat halfway off his head. Walt had known Myra since she was 4 years old. He had once pulled her up out of a grain bin when she was 9. He looked at her now the way a man looks at a person he had given up for dead and then seen walking down the street. He nodded at her. One small nod. Myra saw it. She nodded back. The funeral did not stop. It just changed shape. The service finished. People stood. The pastor said the closing words in a voice that had lost its softness. Most of the mourners filed out without speaking to anyone. A few stopped at the casket and crossed themselves. None of them touched the yellow envelope. It sat on the lid like a small dog nobody wanted to claim. Outside, the sky had gone gray. The wind dropped to nothing. A church bell 2 blocks over rang the hour. For about 3 minutes, the world of Cedar Hollow felt very calm. Almost peaceful. Like a town that had just exhaled after holding its breath for half a century. People stood in small groups on the lawn and talked in low voices about the corn and the rain and a neighbor's new tractor. A boy of about 10 kicked a stone across the gravel. Somewhere down the block, a screen door slapped shut. It was, for a short little stretch, an ordinary afternoon in an ordinary town. Then Garrett came out the side door of the funeral home, walking fast, and Daniel Voss came right behind him. Garrett did not stop at the steps. He came straight across the lot toward Myra's car, with both hands open at his sides. Halfway across, he bent down and picked up a piece of gravel and threw it at the hood of the Chevy. It cracked off the metal. He shouted one word. He shouted, "Leave. This is where it turns." Chapter 4. Garrett crossed the last 20 feet in 5 strides. Myra had her hand on the car door. He grabbed her wrist before she could open it. His grip was the same as the night in the upstairs hallway. The same weight. The same anger that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. She did not pull away. She let him hold her. She looked him in the face and she said, "You do this in front of these people, Garrett, and you do it on the day they buried him." Think, he thought. You could see it move across his eyes. His fingers loosened. He stepped back. Daniel Voss caught up and put a flat hand on Garrett's shoulder and said, "In the office. Now, all 3 of you." The office was 2 blocks away, above the hardware store. A narrow staircase. A frosted glass door with Voss and Voss painted on it in gold letters, even though there had never been a second Voss. Inside, a green banker's lamp. A wall of leather books nobody had opened in a decade. A single oak desk with a blotter worn through in the center. Myra sat. Garrett sat. Voss stayed standing. He poured himself a glass of water from a pitcher and did not offer one to anyone else. He said, "The will is clear. Filed last Tuesday. The farm, the equipment, the mineral rights, all to Garrett Havorson's son. Nothing to the daughter." He used the word daughter like it was a foreign coin he was not sure was real. Myra opened the yellow envelope. She unfolded the paper inside. It was brown at the edges. The state seal in the corner was still crisp. She set it on the desk facing Voss. She said, "In 1983, my mother, Ruth Havorson, was deeded these 200 acres by her own father, Jonas Bell, on the condition that the land passed to her firstborn daughter at the age of 18. Not the husband. Not the son. The daughter. My mother slipped me this deed the night before I left, in the upstairs bathroom, with the water running so my father would not hear. She told me to keep it until I was strong enough to use it. She died before I was. But the deed did not die with her." Voss did not look at the paper. He said that document was never recorded. Myra said, "It was filed in Jasper County on March 4, 1983, by my grandfather himself. I have the receipt. I have a witness copy from the county recorder's office, dated last Friday. And if you tell me one more lie in this room, I will walk to that pay phone on the corner and call the state bar." Voss sat down. Garrett stared at the deed like it was a snake. He said, "Mom never." He stopped. He started again. He said, "Mom never told me." Myra said no. She did not. Because she knew you. She knew exactly what you would do. Garrett said, "What did she think I would do?" Myra said, "She thought you would burn it. She thought you would take it to Dad, and the 2 of you would burn it together in the backyard fire pit, and she would never see it again. She told me that, Garrett." word for word. In the bathroom in 2004, with the water running. I was 16 years old and I memorized it because I knew I was never going to hear her voice again. Garrett did not say anything. He looked at the floor. Myra said, "Do you remember the summer she got the lump in her chest?" Garrett said, "The one in her arm." Myra said, "The one in her chest, Garrett." Doctor said it was probably benign. Doctor said come back in 3 months. Dad would not pay for the second visit. He said it was a waste of money. He said she was being soft. She lived another 4 years. The stroke was not the lump. But the lump never got checked. Voss said, "This is not relevant to the deed." Myra said, "It is relevant to why she gave the deed to me and not to my brother. And it is relevant to whether anyone in this room is going to look me in the eye and call my mother a liar. If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button." Garrett's face did something Myra had not expected. It cracked, just at the corner of his mouth. For half a second he looked 16 years old again, sitting at the dinner table while their father told him he was the only one who counted. Then the moment passed and he was 41 again, and he was angry again. He said, "I have farmed that ground for 22 years. Myra said, "On land that was never legally his to leave you." Voss raised both hands like a man stopping traffic. Voss said, "Even if the deed is valid, even if it was recorded, your mother is deceased. There is a question of probate. There is a question of how Ruth Halvorson's estate was settled. There is a question of whether your father, as her surviving spouse, took those acres into the marital estate." Myra said, "My mother and father had a prenuptial. Signed in 1979. Filed in the same drawer as the deed. I have a copy of that too." Voss closed his eyes. Garrett looked at Voss the way a son looks at a father who has just dropped a hammer on the son's foot. He said, "You told me this was clean." Voss did not answer. Outside, a horn honked. A dog barked. Myra folded her hands in her lap and waited. Chapter 5. Voss broke first. He pushed back his chair and walked to the window and stood with his back to the room. After a long minute he said, "There is a way." He turned around. He said, "The firstborn daughter clause was unusual but enforceable under Iowa law in 1983. If your documents are what you say they are, the title never legally passed to Harold. Which means it never legally passed to Garrett." Myra said, "I want a hearing. I want it on the public docket. I want every person in this town to be able to walk in and watch." Voss said, "You understand that if you do this in open court, you will tear this family apart in front of 900 neighbors." Myra said, "My family was torn apart on a Friday in 2004, while this town stood on its porches and did nothing. I'm not afraid of the audience, Mr. Voss. I have been the audience." Garrett stood up. He walked to the window where Voss had been. He put his forehead against the glass. For a long time he did not speak. When he did, his voice was low. He said, "The house is mine. I built the new wing. I poured the concrete on the machine shed in 2011. I put the new roof on after the hail in 2018. That is my work." Myra said, "The house and the improvements you put on it after 1990, one can be valued and bought out. That is fair. That is the law. But the dirt under it is mine." Garrett turned around. He said, "You would do that to my boys." Myra said, "Your boys are not the ones who broke my ribs." The room went quiet for a long time. Then Myra did something she had not planned. She had spent the whole drive down telling herself she would not do this. She had told herself it was a private letter from a dead woman to her 2 living children, and that nobody else needed to read it. But the room had changed her mind. Voss with his glass of water. Garrett with his fingerprints still on her wrist. The town outside the window going on with its quiet, ordinary day, while inside this room she was once again being asked to prove she had a right to exist. She reached into her coat and pulled out a second envelope. Smaller. White. She set it on the desk between them. She said, "This is a letter from our mother." dated the same night as the deed. I have read it once in 22 years. I am not going to read it again in this room. But you are going to read it, Garrett. Right now. In front of Mr. Voss. And then you and I are going to decide what kind of brother and sister we are going to be for the rest of our lives. Garrett picked up the envelope. His hands were not steady. He opened it. He read it. It took him about 2 minutes. The letter was written in their mother's small leaning script on a single page of stationery from a hotel in Des Moines, the one their mother had stayed at the only time she had ever been to the city. The letter named Garrett. It named the night in the upstairs hallway. It named the doctor visit that never happened. It named 2 other things their mother had carried alone for years that Myra had never told another living person about. When he finished, he set the letter face down on the desk. He put both his hands flat on top of it. He did not move for almost a minute. Then he said she knew. Myra said she knew everything. He said she let it happen. Myra said she was afraid of him. The same as we were. She said that in the letter, in her own words. You just read it. Garrett sat back down. He looked at the floor. He said, "What do you want, Myra?" "Really?" Myra said, "I want the deed recognized. I want the land put in my name. I want the option to lease the corn ground back to you for a fair market rent for as long as you want to farm it. I want the machine shed and the house bought out at appraised value, payable over 10 years, no interest. I want my mother's grave moved from the family plot, where my father is now buried, to the Bell family plot in Walnut Grove. Because she never wanted to lie next to him. And she told me so in the bathroom in 2004, with the water running." Voss wrote it all down. His pen moved fast and quiet. Garrett said the lease. "How long?" Myra said, "As long as you farm it well, Garrett. And as long as you never raise a hand to another person on that ground again." He nodded once. Slow. Like a man agreeing to a sentence he had earned. That was the payoff she had carried for 22 years. It did not feel the way she had thought it would feel. It felt like setting down a bucket of cold water she had been carrying with both arms since she was 16. Her shoulders did not know what to do without it. Voss handed Garrett the pen. Garrett signed. He signed slowly, the way a man signs a paper he has been afraid of for most of his adult life. He signed an acknowledgement of the deed. He signed a statement of intent to enter into a lease. He signed a draft buyout schedule for the house and shed at appraised value. Each signature was a small surrender. Each signature was also, in a way Myra had not expected, a small relief on his face. As if a weight had been on him too, and he had not realized he was the one carrying it. When he was done, he put the pen down. He looked at his sister across the desk for a long moment. He did not apologize. Neither of them was ready for that. But he nodded once more, slow and even, and Myra understood it as the closest thing to an apology a man like her brother was going to make in this lifetime. She nodded back. Chapter 6. The hearing was held 3 weeks later in the Jasper County Courthouse. A red brick building with a clock tower that ran 4 minutes fast. The courtroom held about 60 people. It was full by 9 in the morning. Walt Tilden was there in the back row with his hat in his lap. Reverend Pike was there. Pam the waitress drove down from Minneapolis and sat behind Myra and squeezed her shoulder once before the judge came in. The judge was a woman named Alina Briggs. She had been on the bench 20 years. She read the documents. She asked Voss 2 questions. She asked Garrett 1. She asked Myra none. Then she ruled from the bench. The deed was valid. Title had never passed to Harold Halvorson. Myra Halvorson was, and had been since the age of 18, the legal owner of 200 acres of bottom ground along the Cedar River. The gavel came down at 9:41 in the morning. Myra did not celebrate. She walked out of the courthouse and stood on the steps and looked at the sky. It was a soft gray. The kind of sky her mother had loved. Garrett came out a minute later. He stopped at the top of the steps. He did not look at her. He said, "The corn is in the ground already." He said, "The rent." Myra said, 400 an acre. He said, "That is fair." She said, "I know." He walked down the steps and across the lawn to his truck. He drove away without looking back. She watched him go, and she did not feel triumph. She felt something quieter. She felt like a door that had been jammed for 22 years had finally swung open, and on the other side of it was nothing but a long, ordinary hallway she could walk down without flinching. 3 months later, Myra moved her mother's grave to Walnut Grove. It was a small ceremony. Just her, Reverend Pike, and an old neighbor named Cora Pettit, who had been her mother's best friend in high school. Cora was 81 years old and walked with a cane. She had driven herself to the cemetery in a powder blue station wagon that was older than Myra. Cora brought a small bouquet of yellow daisies wrapped in wax paper. She had picked them that morning from her own front yard. She said yellow had been Ruth's favorite color. Myra had not known that. There were 100 small things about her own mother that Myra had not been allowed to know. She was learning them one at a time, from old women in small towns in pieces. They stood by the new stone in the soft afternoon light. The stone read, "Ruth Bell Havorson, beloved daughter, beloved mother." There was no mention of a husband. That had been Myra's choice and her mother's, made together in a bathroom in 2004 with the water running. Cora read the stone out loud. Then Cora cried for about a minute, quiet and steady, the way old women cry when they have outlived too many friends. Myra put her arm around Cora's shoulders. They stood like that until the sun moved off the stone. Myra did not move back to Cedar Hollow. She did not want to. She rented the corn ground to Garrett at 400 an acre, paid every March. She used the first year's check to pay off her divorce lawyer. She used the second to put a down payment on a small house in a town 2 states away, near a lake, with a porch that faced east. Pam came down for the housewarming and brought back the borrowed black dress, cleaned, in a garment bag. Myra hung it in the closet and did not throw it out. She and Garrett spoke twice a year after that. Once in March when the rent was paid. Once in November when the harvest was done. The conversations were short. They were not warm. But they were not cruel. That was more than either of them had grown up with. In the 3rd year, Garrett's older boy graduated high school. Garrett mailed Myra a copy of the program. He had circled the boy's name in pencil. There was no note. Myra put the program on her refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a sunflower. She left it there for a year. In the 4th year, Garrett's wife sent a Christmas card. The card had 3 photographs in it. One of the boys. One of the dog. One of a corner of the farmhouse porch in winter. Myra did not write back. But she did not throw the card away either. She kept it in a drawer with her mother's letter and the original deed and the receipt from the county recorder's office. She thought of that drawer as a kind of fireproof box. It held the only papers in her life that mattered. It also held now the small green shoots of a family that had once been clear-cut to the ground and was, very slowly, trying to grow back. The last time Myra drove through Cedar Hollow, she pulled over at the cemetery on the south edge of town. Her father's stone was already weathering. She stood at the foot of it for a long time. She did not speak. She did not cry. She had said everything she had to say on the day she set the yellow envelope down on his coffin. She turned and walked back to her car through the soft Iowa grass. She got in. She drove east into the rising sun. And she did not look back, not once, not even at the line where Jasper County ended and the rest of her life began.